Vienna. The gunman was killed and lives saved by 2 members of the Capitol Police Force. We have Fox team coverage. Catherine Herridge tells us about the shooter. But we begin with Chief Congressional Correspondent Mike Emanuel at the crime scene just outside Washington. Good evening, Mike.
Chris, good evening. The FBI says the gunman had been in the area since March, living in his vehicle, a white cargo van, and had 2 weapons, a rifle and a handgun, a gunman taking aim at Republican lawmakers. Eyewitness video reveals the moment of the attack early this morning.
A lot of us dove into the dugout and tried to get as many as we could. But then at that point, there was firing behind us from the security detail, the Capitol Police. And I started yelling back, "Are you friendly?"
Those on the GOP team were left trying to make sense of the violence.
This political rhetoric and political discourse that has led to hate has led to gunfire. I never thought I'd go to baseball practice for charity and have to dodge bullets.
The Capitol Police began returning fire. I do believe that without the Capitol Hill Police, it would have been a massacre.
House Republican Whip Steve Scalise was wounded and remains in critical condition after surgery. Staffer Zachary Barth and former staffer Matt Micah were also hurt. And Special Agents David Bailey and Crystal Griner were injured responding to the attack. President Trump reacted from the White House.
Authorities are continuing to investigate the crime, and the assailant has now died from his injuries.
Authorities identified the gunman as James Hodgkinson of Illinois. He was a campaign volunteer for Senator Bernie Sanders.
I am sickened by this despicable act, and let me be as clear as I can be. Violence of any kind is unacceptable in our society, and I condemn this action in the strongest possible terms.
Just before the shooting, one player said he was approached by the suspect.
He asked me if this team was the Republican or Democrat team practicing. I responded that it was a Republican team practicing, and he proceeded to shoot Republicans. You take that for what it's worth.
Members of the Democrats team stopped at their practice this morning to pray for the GOP players. House members were told that the congressional baseball game would go on as planned, and sources say that received a standing ovation.
We're not going to let incidents like this change our way of life or our daily routines.
It will be play ball tomorrow night at 7:05.
The annual game is expected to raise more than $600,000, benefiting local boys and girls clubs and a literacy group, and Scalise plays second base. By midday, Speaker Paul Ryan addressed the House, calling for solidarity.
We are united in our shock. We are united in our anguish. An attack on one of us is an attack on all of us.
Moments later, House Democratic leader Nancy Pelosi echoed a bipartisan sentiment.
We are not one caucus or the other in this House today, but we speak for each other in saying that we send our thoughts and prayers to our colleague, Steve Scalise.
Among the questions now, do rank-and-file lawmakers need armed security? Some of those who were on the field this morning seem shaken by the events, what law enforcement just described as a combat scene. And in that theme of unity, the Democrats team has offered to host the Republican team for dinner. Chris?
Mike Emanuel at the crime scene just outside Washington. Mike, thanks for that. We have been gathering information all day about the gunman. Chief Intelligence Correspondent Catherine Herridge has that part of the story.
Law enforcement identifies the suspect as 66-year-old James Hodgkinson of Illinois. A Facebook page bearing the same name includes photos of Bernie Sanders as well as anti-Trump rhetoric. One post reads, "Trump is a traitor. Trump has destroyed our democracy. It's time to destroy Trump and company."
I've given a statement to the Alexandria Police Department.
Republican Congressman Jeff Duncan says he believes the suspect approached him at the ball field.
I did have an interaction with someone in the parking lot who asked me if the team practicing was a Democrat or a Republican team. I told him they were Republicans. He said, "Okay, thanks," turned around. I got in the car and left.
And that was the conversation he had, and it was only as they were driving
and they said
back
he
that they heard
acted
the
a
news
little
reports.
weird.
Yeah,
what he did.
A spokesperson for the American Society of Home Inspectors confirms a James Hodgkinson was a member of the trade association but dropped out in 2015. A few years earlier, a local Illinois newspaper reports that the suspect sent letters to the editor senator railing against Republicans and tax policies. In this August 2012 letter, Hodgkinson writes, "I have never said life sucks, only the policies of the Republicans." This man says he's a friend of the suspect.
Well, he never backed down from anybody. In a bar fight or whatever, he stood his ground.
But it was that kind of kid stuff, or was it political?
No.
The New York Times interviewed the suspect's brother, who says the 66-year-old was upset over the election of President Trump and went to Washington within the last few weeks to protest. This account appears consistent with a local news report that a neighbor had not seen Hodgkinson in months, though his wife still lives at this home in Belleville, Illinois, where the FBI is on the scene. A law enforcement source tells Fox the Bureau gets involved when police officers and members of Congress are assaulted. At this morning's news conference,
we had no prior information that would lead us to believe that anything like this was going to occur.
Are you certain members of Congress were being targeted, though? Was this an intentional attack on members of Congress?
Too early to tell if they were targeted or not.
At a news conference within the last hour, the FBI confirming that the ATF is running a trace on 2 weapons, to include a rifle and a handgun, also saying that the FBI is very focused on a motive, and so far no indication why the suspect chose today. Chris.
Catherine, thank you.
You're welcome.
Let's get more now from 2 congressmen who were at that field practicing when the shooting started. Jack Bergman is a retired Marine Corps Lieutenant General, congressman from Michigan. Brad Wenstrup is a doctor and a veteran of the Iraq War, congressman from Ohio. First, gentlemen, let me say how glad I am to see both of you here tonight. And let me begin with that, Congressman. How are you? I assume the shock is beginning to wear off and you realize what you were through.
Well, you know, we're all here by the grace of God. And I think a hand played in today, because you look at the potential scenarios and outcomes, could have been a lot different if the Capitol Police hadn't done what they did.
Congressman Wenstrup.
Well, the situation's surreal in many ways. I've been in that type of environment before, and you just let your instincts kick in and go to work. But what other people need to know, especially people who have never been in that environment, they have to know what normal is. And afterwards is when it starts to kick in, and you start thinking about your family and what maybe could have happened today, and they just need to be prepared for that.
Congressman Wenstrup, you were a combat surgeon in Iraq. You've been in these kinds of situations before. How intense was what people are now calling a combat zone, a firefight?
Oh, it was very intense, especially from the standpoint that we didn't have weapons, and from the standpoint that you don't have infantry and other troops around you that can take action. But we did have 2 very excellent Capitol Hill police that did an outstanding job and got injured in the process, but they carried out their mission.
Congressman Bergman, did you think at any point in this that this might be it for you and for all of your colleagues?
Absolutely. When we were in the dugout after scrambling around beforehand, my only thought was, if he breaks through the Capitol Police and comes around that corner into that dugout, we were all sitting ducks.
Yeah, I mean, let's just explain the scene. You were on the field, you crawled off the field, you went behind the dugout, then you went in, which was slightly below the ground, but you were all unprotected. So if he had been able to get there, you were all just lined up. You were just sitting ducks, as you say.
We were looking for anything that we could pick up if he came around the corner to engage him.
Congressman Wenstrup, tough question. Yeah. Did you, at any point in this, did you think to yourself, this may be it? We could die here?
I really wasn't thinking about that. It was much more about how we're going to get through this. And he was very calculated. He used the third base dugout as protection. He used another building as protection. And he was calculated, and he was herding us into one spot. And without the Capitol Hill Police there to fight back, I don't even want to think about how that might have been.
When you say he was herding you into one spot, explain that, because I've not heard that before.
Well, there was only one entrance into the park, and once you're in that park and on the field, you're inside of a fence. And the only way out is through this one entrance by the first base dugout. And so he starts down on the left field line along third base and starts shooting. So where do people run? We run towards the exit, we run towards the dugout. Right. And you try to take cover. And then he starts maneuvering closer to that spot. And then even comes around from behind home plate. And that's what led to his demise.
Now, Would you explain that?
Because the Capitol Hill police were in that position, and they were positioned to where they could fire back.
Where were they? I mean, you were all in the dugout. You're on the field, you're in the dugout. Where were the police before the shooting started?
They are outside that exit that we described that's on the first base line and by the dugout. That's where they're positioned. And when this started happening, you know, they get out behind their car and start to position. So he was coming closer. We had people that were taking cover behind trees and then trying to move behind hardened facilities. They had to move because he was moving. And they weren't safe just in one spot behind the tree.
When did you hear? As the shooting stopped, you rushed out on the field to your colleague Steve Scalise, who had been hit. He's through surgery. He apparently is in critical condition, according to the hospital. As somebody who was there, a doctor tending to his wounds, how badly hit was he?
Well, you can't really tell because I found the entry wound. I was able to go in and open things up to where I could see where he was hit.
Which was where?
Which was on his left hip, on the side, and I could not see an exit wound. So what that's telling me is I don't know where that actually trajected. Was it lodged in his hip? Did it move further up? Did it hit internal organs? Did it hit large vessels? So although you got the bleeding controlled, which we were able to do with tourniquet, et cetera, in that spot, you don't know what other damage is taking place inside. That was my concern. I kept talking to him. He answered my questions. We got him fluids as best we could because I knew he's losing some fluid inside there. And as soon as he could get some help, get an IV, then it was off to the hospital.
Congressman Bergman, there have been a lot of calls today for unity on Capitol Hill, for dialing down the partisan rhetoric. Obviously, there's a kind of a kumbaya moment right now on the Hill, but do you think it can last? Do you think this can change the way folks do business on Capitol Hill and in all of Washington, including us and the media?
I think it has to change. In fact, one of the stories that would have been a really nice story about 4 months ago was how the freshman class, both Democrats and Republicans, signed a letter of commitment to civility because we didn't like what we were seeing. We're new. We're freshmen. Never got any traction because it wasn't a big deal. Well, I guess I'll tell you what, it's a big deal. Everybody's got skin in the game now. If they don't realize it, have them come talk to some of us.
Same question for you, Congressman Wenstrup. You know, we see these crises. We've seen it all too often before. Not here. This hits home. This hits you guys directly in a way that most of them don't, except for Gabby Giffords. But do you think this maybe changes the division, the partisan, ugly gridlock here in Washington?
You know, I certainly hope so. Just a week or so ago, I actually wrote a piece that I entitled, "United We Stand, Divided We Fall." We have been tearing each other apart in far too many ways, whether it's members of Congress, whether it's the media, whether it's individuals just out there in their communities. And I think that we should be celebrating the fact that we live in a country where the people get to decide who their elected officials are. We should be grateful for that. You don't always get the one you voted for. And that shouldn't turn into anger, but it should turn into being part of the debate and part of the policy discussion and not violence.
Now, the baseball game is on for tomorrow night. Congressman, you going to be there?
Absolutely. In uniform, ready to go.
What position do you play, sir?
Well, I'm infield. I'm a freshman, so I'm one of the backups right now. So, but the point is, I came to play, I came to win, and I came to have fun with folks, all the folks in uniform. In fact, the freshmen, Dems and the Republicans, but even before this happened, we're going to get our photo made tomorrow before the game in a show of freshman unity.
Both parties together.
Absolutely.
And Congressman Wenstrup, you're going to be there tomorrow?
Absolutely. You can't keep me from it now.
Gentlemen, thank you. Thanks for telling us your story. Thanks for your bravery. Thanks for your service to the nation. And maybe out of this tragedy, something good can come. We all hope so.
We hope so.
Yeah.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Let's talk more now about the security situation for members of Congress. Fox News senior Capitol Hill producer Chad Pergram joins us from Capitol Hill. Chad, fair to say that if Congressman Scalise, a member of the House leadership, hadn't been there with his security detail, these other members would have had no protection at all.
Well, I think the security people here at the Capitol, the Sergeant-at-Arms and the Capitol Police Chief, Matt Verderosa, would tell you that the system works. Now, you can't put a detail on 435 members of the House of Representatives. After Gabby Giffords was shot a few years ago, they talked about that. There were some people who suggested that. But at the end of the day, there's no way to do that later on.
So, I mean, routinely, if the House whip had not been there, these folks would have been unprotected. Chad? Apparently we've lost Chad Pergram. We'll try to get him back and continue the conversation. There has been some other news today, and here's a look at the headlines on that. The head of the Michigan Health Department and the state's chief medical officer are among 6 people charged in the Flint water crisis. Health Department Chief Nick Lyon, along with 4 others, are charged with involuntary manslaughter. Authorities say they failed to alert the public after an outbreak of Legionnaire's disease following a switch in Flint's water source. The American college student released from a North Korean prison is in a Cincinnati hospital tonight. 22-year-old Otto Warmbier is in a coma. Warmbier was serving a 15-year prison term in North Korea for trying to steal a propaganda banner. Republican Ed Gillespie and Democratic Lieutenant Governor Ralph Northam are the nominees in Virginia's election for governor. Both won primaries last night. At least 12 people are dead in a huge fire that engulfed a high-rise apartment block in London. Witnesses report seeing children being dropped from windows to people in the street. There is no word yet on the cause of the
Entire public schedule, including an event at the Labor Department to promote apprenticeships. But we are told that he will likely resume his full public schedule again tomorrow. Chris?
John, as you know, there's been a lot of talk on Capitol Hill from the two congressmen we just had on set about trying to find a way past the partisan rhetoric that is dividing this town, trying to damp it down, and trying to maybe create a new sense of unity here. Is there any talk about that, about trying to change the tone at the White House?
Well, this president, all during his campaign, said that he wanted to change the tone in Washington. He wanted to change the status quo, wanted to not make it business as usual. In doing that, he promised that he was going to break probably a few more eggs than a lot of people would have preferred. But, Chris, you know, we've been here before. 9/11, other events like that, and we've seen for a moment the country comes together and then inevitably it splits apart again. So not to be a pessimist, but whatever we're seeing today may be short-lived.
Let me ask you one other question before I let you go, John, and that is the congressional baseball game is going to be tomorrow night. Is there any thought of the president attending the game?
No, I mean, he was never thinking about it initially, and the White House has confirmed that plan is not changing. The real problem is that in order to move the president somewhere, particularly in this environment, the Secret Service needs a certain number of days in order to put a security plan in place, and there just isn't time to do it, Chris.
John Roberts reporting from the White House. John, thank you for that. Let's check in now on the victims of today's shooting. Peter Ducey is at George Washington University Hospital, and Doug McElway is at MedStar Washington Hospital Center, where Congressman Steve Scalise is recovering tonight. Good evening, Doug.
Good evening, Chris. House Majority Whip Steve Scalise was brought here to MedStar Washington Hospital Center early this morning with a gunshot wound to his hip. This is a level 1 trauma center, and it is close to inner city neighborhoods where gunshot wounds are not at all uncommon, so they know what they're doing here. After several hours of surgery, the hospital tweeted, quote, Representative Scalise was critically injured and remains in critical condition. The other patient is in good condition. That other patient is Crystal Griner. On Scalise's protective detail, she's a member of the U.S. Capitol Police Force and was wounded in either the ankle or the foot. Among the visitors here today was the chief of the U.S. Capitol Police Force, who said that the other officer who was involved in that shooting, Mr. David Bailey, did not require treatment. Bailey, though, is largely credited with bringing down the gunman, and in so doing may have spared a much larger loss of life. Now for the status of the other victims, let's head over to Peter Ducey, who's at the George Washington University Hospital.
Doug, relatives of Matthew Micah just got here to George Washington University Hospital in the Foggy Bottom neighborhood of Washington, D.C., where they want to be by his bedside at the ICU, where they think he will be for the next couple of days. We first found out that Micah was one of the victims at this hospital from a member of Congress who had been at the baseball practice, and the Micah family says the former college baseball player who was helping coach the Republican team today and works here in Washington in the Government Affairs Office for Tyson Foods is in critical condition with multiple gunshot wounds. Those are injuries that required surgery today. Micah was one of 2 patients to arrive at this D.C. hospital in an ambulance from Alexandria, Virginia. The other was not a victim. It was the shooter, James Hodgkinson, who arrived here in critical condition but later succumbed to his injuries from gunshot wounds that were suffered when he was confronted by officers who stepped up to stop his ambush in Alexandria. Chris?
Peter Ducey and Doug McElway reporting from the 2 Washington hospitals where victims of the shooting are recovering. Efforts to cut gun violence and gain revenue from gun purchases have run into a setback in Seattle. Correspondent Dan Springer tonight with a big backfire for gun control.
An armed robbery in Seattle ends in a shootout with police. When it was over, 3 cops were injured, 1 critically, and the suspect was dead. It was just one of many recent shootings in the Emerald City this year, as gun violence has spiked, according to Seattle PD. The rise comes a year after Seattle started taxing every gun and bullet sold in the city, $25 per firearm, up to 5 cents for each round of ammunition. It was billed as a way to defray the cost of gun violence, study the problem, and ultimately reduce the carnage. Dave Workman of the Second Amendment Foundation says the tax is a total failure.
The data is there. It says that the law has failed to prevent
what they promised it would prevent.
Since the tax took effect, reports of shots fired are up 26%, shooting injuries climbed 54%, and gun deaths doubled. The tax revenue is funding a University of Washington study looking at ways to reduce repeat gunshot victims.
These individuals are much more likely to come back with other gunshot wounds, to commit subsequent crime, to commit violent crime, or to be murdered.
But the tax is raising much less than advertised. Backers claimed it would bring in between $300,000 and $500,000 a year. The city refused to say what the first-year revenue was, only that it was less than $200,000. Gun dealers believe it's much less. Still, Seattle's paying over $500,000 for the gun study. The bloodshed is up even as gun sales in Seattle plummet. An employee at this sporting goods store says it averages just a few buyers a month. The Precise Shooter store left Seattle and reopened in a neighboring suburb where business is strong. The owner of the lone large gun dealer left in the city told Fox News he has had to lay off 7 employees with gun sales down 60%.
It's a form of gun control, and you know, it's hurting us, it's hurting my employees.
But gun control advocates say be patient.
The causes of gun violence are very complex, and to say that this one study is lacking because it hasn't solved the problem of gun violence in Seattle is frankly laughable.
Seattle police blame the jump in shootings on what plagues every big city: gangs, drugs, and retaliation. Elected leaders who pushed the gun tax declined our numerous requests for an interview. Chris?
Dan Springer reporting from Seattle. Dan, thank you. Up next, the panel discusses today's shooting in Alexandria, Virginia, and the reaction. First, here's what some of our Fox affiliates around the country are covering tonight. Fox 2 in San Francisco, where at least 4 people are dead in a shooting at a UPS facility. One of the dead is the suspected shooter. The man is described as a disgruntled employee. Fox 29 in Philadelphia as jury deliberations continue in the sexual assault trial of Bill Cosby. The actor and comedian could spend the rest of his life in prison if convicted of assaulting a woman at his Philadelphia area home back in 2004. And this is a live look at Atlanta from Fox 5. The big story there tonight: police have just found a car stolen by 2 escaped convicts who murdered 2 prison guards yesterday. Authorities say Ricky DuBose and Donnie Russell Rowe fled after shooting and killing a pair of sergeants from Baldwin State Prison. That's tonight.
I know what he asked me. I know how I answered. I know what happened. So I'm making the assumption that he was targeting Republicans.
There was a barrage of gunfire, and it was chaotic. It was horrible.
Without the Capitol Hill police, it would have been a massacre. They attacked the shooter, and that saved our lives.
And in doing so, got injured themselves. It's remarkable heroism.
Republican members of Congress describing the frightening scene this morning when a gunman attacked them as they practice for tomorrow's bipartisan congressional baseball game. Time to bring in the panel. Steve Hilton, host of The Next Revolution here on Fox News Channel. Katie Pavlich from townhall.com. Susan Page, Washington Bureau Chief of USA Today, and syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer. Well, Susan, I'm sure you've talked to a bunch of people today on Capitol Hill. How shaken are they? How hard has this hit them?
You know, I think it has hit people pretty hard. And I think they're shaken both because of the sense of personal peril in that most members of Congress don't have security with them. But also, in that maybe this will be short-lived, but I think there's also a sense of, have we gone so far in the fierceness of our political debates that, and in things like social media postings that go over the line of civil discourse, that we ought to try to step back. And as I said, we've had that debate before. Is this the time when it has a more lasting effect than it's had?
Yeah, well, I want to pick up on that a little bit later. But Katie, let me ask you, what have you been hearing from members and staff, just the resonance, the echo effect of this terrible event?
Well, clearly the theme of the day has been unity. And I think it's important to point out that Republicans were targeted because of who they are, because of what they believe in, because of the ideas and policies that they have pushed forward. And unity doesn't mean that Republicans and Democrats have to agree. It simply means that they have to make better arguments about their policies rather than going to a lazy debate, quite frankly, about dehumanizing their opponents, talking to each other like they're enemies and they can't come together on these issues. Democrats are now inviting Republicans over to the Democratic Club to have dinner. I think they're reaching out across the aisle, but in terms of whether this is long-term, unfortunately, it seems that a lot of the members are pessimistic about whether this unity theme can really continue.
Steve, I want to pick up on this and to the degree that we can make sense of a senseless act, because we have learned a few things today about the shooter, James Hodgkinson. He was a volunteer for Bernie Sanders. That's mild. He was a member of a much rougher group called Terminate the Republican Party. And some conservatives today have been saying, well, this is kind of an extreme example of the growing anger on the left. To what degree do we ascribe rational political motives to this, and to what degree do we just say it's the act of a deranged individual?
I have to be honest, I think it's almost certain to be the case that it's the latter. I think that it's helpful that this terrible event is prompting this conversation about the nature of our political discourse. I think that's a good thing. I think that if, as you said earlier in the show, if something good comes out of it, that would be great. I am pessimistic about that too, because we've heard it before. But I think to actually link this to political motives is, I think, going too far. There are plenty of people who say extreme things, too many people who say extreme things on social media and elsewhere about politics, but they don't go out and shoot people. And this person clearly went out intending to shoot people. So I just think that, in the end, the action itself is the product of a deranged mind, and we shouldn't read too much into that, but we should be having this conversation about the nature of our politics. We should be having it anyway, but if today prompts us to do it, that's a good thing.
Charles, how much reason should we ascribe to a unreasonable, senseless act?
Well, senseless, I'm not sure is true here. There's a guy who went out not to shoot people. He went out to shoot Republicans. That was clear when he asked who these people were. It's a combination. First of all, you got a guy who is living out of a car since March. So you know this is a man who was somewhat unhinged. Who knows? Later in life is falling apart, although he seems to have had sort of a normal adulthood, or at least he didn't have any signs of psychosis. Let me just contrast this with the shooting of Gabby Gifford, which is the only analogous event that we...
Arizona Congresswoman.
Right. She was shot within minutes, within hours. There was a meme showed up in the major newspapers and elsewhere that this was a result of the climate of hate, of violence perpetrated by Sarah Palin and other extreme Republicans. And they highlighted her website where she was targeting, quote unquote, Democratic districts for winning in the next election, and implying that this was an invitation to shooting. The guy who did this, a guy called Loeffner, was clearly psychotic from the first moment. He had a history of it. People who knew him had complained about his wild behavior. There wasn't a political idea in his head. That was pure psychosis. In this guy, you likely have a combination of somebody who is unhinged, falling apart, but clearly driven by a political purpose, and one that I would say, to echo the words that were used in the Gifford case, a climate of anti-Trump, almost hysteria, that has become the norm. And I think this will help to pull people back and to realize that the kind of language to celebrate, for example, the Julius Caesar in Central Park, in which the Julius Caesar is clearly Donald Trump, as some kind of a great cultural achievement, I think is really appalling. And this is part of all that. I'm not accusing anybody of doing anything, but if you're going to have a standard on this, let's not have a double standard on this.
But you know what happened? It's not as though this guy represents the extremes of the political debate. I mean, obviously, as you say, a lot of people post extreme things, say extreme things, never commit violence. But the fact that our rhetoric generally has gotten so extreme, I think, encourages people who are unhinged to take action, who hear words that people mean as metaphors to be instructions, and end up doing things like this. And that's true in both these cases. You know, I don't think Democrats are responsible for this guy. I don't think Republicans are responsible for the shooting of Gabby Giffords. But the climate does contribute to to people who are not totally there who are deranged to do things that are really unspeakable.
I think there's a real distinction between a psychotic like Loeffner, who had no political motive, which had an obsession with the Congresswoman as a person, and somebody who speaks about, is highly political, acts in the name of, asks somebody, are these Republicans or Democrats, and then he shoots, who I'm sure is not a normal guy. Normal people don't shoot. But I think there's a big difference there, and that's why people ought to be very much more responsible with Trump derangement syndrome.
I want to move it slightly, because there's been a lot of talk in Washington today about trying to tamp down the political fires, trying to create a new sense of unity. Here's a taste of that.
There is one image in particular that this House should keep, and that is a photo I saw this morning of our Democratic colleagues gathered in prayer this morning after hearing the news. For all the noise and all the fury, we are one family.
Particularly sad that at a time when people want us to come together, and we're prepared to come together tomorrow night, that this assault would be made. But we cannot let that be a victory for the assailant or anyone who would think that way.
Katie, you know, you'd like to hope that this would create some new civility, comedy here in Washington. But to take the Gabby Giffords case, I remember President Obama went to Arizona, made a beautiful speech. Everybody thought this is just great. And look where we are now. So it doesn't seem to last.
It is usually temporary, and Nancy Pelosi also said that she prays and hopes that President Trump is safe, that his family is safe, and for the success of his presidency. That is certainly a step in the right direction. Again, you can disagree on things, but also be civil. But one thing I think that is worth mentioning is the uncivil environment that we are in is not just a result of Congress, it's also a result of the larger narrative from the left and the right, and that is perpetuated in the media as well. And I think that conservatives, Republicans, Trump supporters, Tea Party supporters have been very, very frustrated over the last 6 or 7 years because they have constantly been accused of fomenting this vitriolic environment, fomenting violent rhetoric, and yet here we are today, and the actions of this gunman are his and his alone. However, I think they're very frustrated when there's a direct political connection to someone like Bernie Sanders, and if this had been on the other side of the coin, I think the environment would have been much different.
Quick final thought, Steve?
You know, this discussion reminds me of some of the things that are often said after a terrorist attack. It's the same thing. We've got to come together, we've got to fight this Islamist terror, and in the end, nothing much happens. It's the same old story, and I just really think that we'll hear all this, but in the end, nothing will really change. And one of the reasons is not just that politicians want to, you know, in the end, win and attack their opponents. Social media, the way that people express their views these days, enables the darkest and worst aspects of human nature to come to the fore. And I think we're going to see more of it unless we're prepared to really rein